Good morning. It's been a little bit. Haven't been really posting a lot on Facebook, but I was on the way in this morning, and I've had a topic that keeps coming up. And this morning, as part of my reading, I was reading Exodus, and Exodus gets pretty hot and heavy pretty quick. And if you haven't really taken the time to read through Exodus lately, I think it's probably going to be worth it. And look through there with the idea of going, hey, what can I get out of this? What is the Lord trying to teach me and show me? Because there's all kinds of things in here. I mean, just in chapter 1, it starts off with some things that we're dealing with in our society. And I think that it's pretty neat. Of course, first the chapter starts off talking about the reminds you, says, hey, okay, basically in Genesis we left off here. These are the people of Israel that came to live in Egypt, and after a while the Lord multiplied them. The Lord really blessed them in Egypt, and they grew, and they grow so big and so many in number that the Pharaoh starts to wonder, hey, if something happens, if the political climate changes, then these guys may actually come to the aid of one of our enemies. And so he decides that he needs to do something about that. And what he decides to do is that since they keep numbering so much, that he needs to do some population control. And so in verse 16 it says, and when, let me back up to 15. It says, and the king of Egypt spake unto the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, excuse me, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and you see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then he shall live. What we're talking about there is something that we're dealing with here in American society, and we've been dealing with it for a while, and that's abortion. And if you look at this abortion, it's for the same kind of reasons that abortion started here with in the United States, or I would say started, but became such a big money-making machine. Is that abortion was started really as a form of population control, same as in China and that kind of deal. But this was against a particular race that it was originally had become such a big business against, and the poor and particular races and stuff like that, to minimize their effect, because they want the powers that be wanted to stay in control. And this is the same thing that Egypt is happening, so it's nothing new. Abortion is easily identifiable with racism and, like I said before, population control. I think we should go on a little bit further. It says, but in verse 17 it says, but the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the children alive. I think it's very interesting to see here is that for those of you who are not familiar with the Bible and the order of things, the law of Moses, which we call the Ten Commandments, does not exist yet. Not only that, these are Egyptians, pagan, I guess we would say that, and probably looking down our nose as we say it. But these ladies knew what the Pharaoh was asking them was wrong. No one had to tell them it was wrong. No one had to tell them that to murder a baby was wrong. They knew it already in their hearts. Right? This is a law that didn't need to get put out. It was something that was understood just by nature itself, that you don't kill babies, you don't murder babies, you don't abort babies. So they knew it was wrong before the law of Moses was even put into effect, before anybody even had to tell them. They knew it was wrong to kill the babies. And they feared God. They knew that there was a judgment that would come upon them, that God would look at them and punish them for the act of murdering an innocent. So they feared God. And they refused not to do what the king said. They stood up against the government, the ruler. Now, let me tell you something about this. The king, if you look back in Genesis, when Joseph was in charge of all the lands and stuff like that that went on in Egypt, he was in charge of everything. Part of the thing that Joseph did was there was a great famine, and everybody's had to come back to the Pharaoh, basically, or Joseph, because that was his office and controlled that. We call that the State Department or whatever. But he controlled Homeland Security. He owned. He was in charge of the land and the food, the food of Egypt. So as the people came, they would pay, and Joseph would give them grain so they could feed their families and plant crops and that kind of stuff. But the famine kept going on, and so the crops weren't as successful as they should have been, and so people had to come back and get more each year. And each year they had less and less stuff to give to Joseph and to the Pharaoh to keep their families alive. Eventually what they had to do was sell them very selves into slavery and give all their land to the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh, the monarchy, I guess you would call it, of Egypt, controlled everything. So whenever you're standing up against the king here, you're standing up against everything. I mean, you can lose everything that you have. So these midwives put themselves in standing up for what was right against the government, put themselves in a very, very precarious situation. And verse 18, it says, And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, Why have ye done this thing, and have saved all the men alive? He said, Why did you disobey me? Why are you going against me? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women. These are strong women. That's basically what they said. They are lively. They don't just lay down in a bed, basically, and wait for the baby to come out, and they have a baby and they get right back to work, basically what they're saying. So they are lively, and they delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. So they're already having the babies. By the time the midwife gets there, the baby's already born, and the midwife's saying, so we can't just take it and kill it. And because of the faithfulness of the midwives, for them understanding that killing a baby was wrong, and standing up against the king, taking that chance to do the right thing, putting themselves at risk. In verse 20 it says, Therefore God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. So the Israelis continued to grow, right, in number, but God blessed the midwives. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. The Lord provided for them. He provided for them because they stood up for him. They realized that God was not in that decree, and they realized that there was a higher authority than the Pharaoh, and that was God himself. And they feared God, they respected God, and God stood up for them because they stood up for God. That's pretty amazing. Now, these are Egyptians, not Israelis. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So the Pharaoh said, okay, fine, if you don't want to kill them in the womb, they're being slicker, right, and then we can't catch them as they're having a baby and abort them right there. We'll just flat out murder the babies. And that leads into the story of Moses. But I wanted to make a point here with this. One is that we know abortion is wrong. There's no reason why we should put up with it here in the United States. Especially as Christians, we need to get vocal about this. We need to get our legislature involved. We need to support the legislation that's out there already, that's trying to change things in our lives, especially in this state here, Texas, because it looks like the federal government's going to push it back to state control over abortion. And we need to be active in our state and active in other states to go ahead and make sure that this crime is stopped totally. And we need to seek the Lord God and fear God, not man. All right? God bless you.